My sister wore my wedding dress to a party and laughed when I cried. She said I was being too sensitive. She said it was just fabric. But it was not just fabric. It was the dress I had saved for 2 years to buy. It was the dress I had altered 3 times so it would fit my body perfectly. And she put it on without asking, without caring, and without apology. That was the moment I realized she had been stealing from me for years. Not just things, not just objects. My entire life. By the time I understood the full picture, she had taken my home, my financial future, my closest friendships, the man I almost married, and the version of myself I had spent 31 years building. And every single person in my family had watched it happen and said nothing. Some of them helped her do it. They smiled at me while she was dismantling my life behind my back. I want to tell you what happened, all of it, because I stayed quiet for too long, because I believed it was love, because I thought forgiveness meant letting people keep hurting you, and because the ending of this story is not what anyone expected, including me. Before I go any further, I need to ask you something. If the person who was supposed to love you the most was secretly the one destroying you the most, how long do you think it would take you to see it? How many times would you excuse it, explain it away, or blame yourself before the truth finally became impossible to ignore? Stay with me, because this story is going to ask you that question in a way you will not forget. My name is Sophia. I am 33 years old. I have a small apartment now that I chose entirely by myself. The dishes are mine, the furniture is mine, the quiet is mine. And for the first time in my adult life, nothing in my home belongs to someone who is slowly taking pieces of me without my permission. I want to start at the end, so you understand why the beginning matters so much. 3 months ago, my sister called me from a hospital waiting room. She was crying so hard she could barely speak. She needed money. She needed someone to make calls on her behalf. She needed someone to come and sit with her and help her figure out what to do next. And when I heard her voice after everything she had done, after every single thing I am about to tell you, I felt something I did not expect. I felt calm, not cold, not cruel, just calm. Like a woman who had finally finished a very long book and already knew how the chapter ended. I did not go. I did not send money. I told her I hoped she would be okay, and I hung up the phone, and I sat in my quiet apartment surrounded by things that were only mine, and I felt the strangest, most overwhelming sense of peace I had ever felt in my life. To understand why that phone call happened, and why I answered the way I did, you have to understand where we started. My sister's name is Vanessa. She is 14 months younger than me. Growing up, people always said we looked alike. Same dark hair, same eyes, but where I was quiet and careful, Vanessa was loud and magnetic. She walked into rooms and people turned. She laughed and people leaned closer. My mother used to say Vanessa had a gift. She never said that about me. What my mother said about me was that I was dependable, that I was the responsible one, that I was the one she could count on. I was 10 years old the first time I understood that being dependable was not the same thing as being loved. But I told myself it did not matter. I told myself I was fine. I told myself family was family and love showed up in different ways. That is the first lie I believed. It would not be the last. We grew up in a mid-sized house in a quiet neighborhood. My father worked in logistics. My mother managed the house and a part-time bookkeeping job she never seemed to enjoy. We were not wealthy, but we were comfortable. There was enough for school trips and birthday dinners and the occasional family vacation. What there was not enough of, though I did not have the language for it then, was equity. My parents gave Vanessa and me different versions of the same resources. Vanessa got her driving lessons paid for. I took a weekend job at 16 to pay for mine. Vanessa got a new laptop for college. I was handed my father's old one, which crashed twice in my first semester and lost an entire research paper I had spent 3 weeks writing. When I brought this up at dinner once, my father looked uncomfortable, and my mother said I was making things about money that were not about money. I did not bring it up again. But I always noticed. When I was 22, I got my first real job at a mid-sized marketing firm. I had worked hard in college. I had 2 internships, a portfolio, and a letter of recommendation from a professor who told me I had one of the most organized strategic minds she had seen in her 20 years of teaching. I was proud of that job. I was proud of the salary, which was not huge but was mine. I owned a small apartment, signed my own lease for the first time, and felt something that I now understand was the first true breath I had ever taken as an adult. Vanessa at 21 had dropped out of her second college and was living at home. My parents were not worried about this. They said she was figuring herself out. They said she just needed time. I remember nodding at the dinner table and thinking I never got time to figure myself out. But I said nothing, because I was dependable, because I was the responsible one, because I had already learned that pointing out the difference in how we were treated only made me the ungrateful one. About 6 months into my new job, I met a man named Daniel. Daniel was a project manager at a firm that shared our building. We met in the elevator on a Tuesday morning. He was carrying too much coffee and I held the door for him and he laughed and said he owed me a favor. He paid the favor back 3 days later by bringing me a coffee and leaving it at the front desk with a note that had his number on it. I still have that note, not because I am sentimental about him. I keep it to remind myself that the beginning of something can look completely different from what it becomes. Daniel and I dated for a year before becoming serious. He was steady, he was thoughtful. He cooked dinner on Sundays and remembered what I said about things that mattered to me. He met my parents 8 months in and my mother immediately liked him. My father approved. And Vanessa, who came to that family dinner in a new outfit she had asked to borrow $20 from me to buy, smiled at him all evening and told me afterward that I had done well for myself. I remember feeling warm when she said that. I remember thinking she was proud of me. I want to pause here and tell you something. When you love people, you see them through a filter. The filter is made out of history, hope, and the specific loneliness that comes from wanting to be loved back by someone who does not quite love you the same way you love them. That filter lets things through that should not get through. It softens what should be seen clearly. I had that filter over my eyes for a very long time when it came to Vanessa, and it cost me more than I can put a number on. Daniel and I got engaged when I was 25. He proposed on a Saturday evening in the apartment we had started sharing 6 months earlier. Simple, quiet, just the two of us and a ring he had picked out himself. He told me he had chosen it because it looked like something I would choose, and he was right. It was simple and elegant and exactly my taste. I said yes immediately. I cried a little. We ordered takeout and sat on the floor eating noodles and talking about what we wanted the next chapter to look like. I called my mother first. She screamed with joy. I called Vanessa second. She was quiet for a moment and then said, "Oh wow, congratulations." Something in her voice was flat. I told myself she was tired. I told myself I was reading into it. I drove to my parents' house the next day and Vanessa hugged me and looked at my ring and said it was beautiful, and I let myself believe the flatness on the phone had been nothing. 3 weeks later, Vanessa got a job at the same firm where Daniel worked. She had called me first, excited, telling me she had put his name as a reference contact, just a point of contact, not a formal reference, and she hoped that was okay. She had already done it. She was calling to tell me after the fact. I said it was fine, because what else do you say? Within 2 months, Vanessa and Daniel were having regular work lunches. Within 4 months, they were in a project group together. Within 6 months, I was noticing a texture change in my relationship with Daniel that I could not quite name. He was still kind, still present, but something was slightly different in the way he looked at his phone sometimes. Something was slightly off in how certain evenings felt. I told myself I was anxious. I told myself I was making things up. I told myself this is what happens when you are planning a wedding and feeling overwhelmed. I bought my wedding dress 9 months before the wedding. I found it at a small boutique that a colleague had recommended. It was ivory with a modest train and a fitted bodice and simple lace along the shoulders. The first time I tried it on, I cried, not dramatically, just quietly, the way you cry when something fits you perfectly in every sense of the word. I paid for it in 2 installments. I had it altered twice, and then once more after I lost a little weight from the stress of planning. I kept it in its garment bag in the spare room closet, and I did not let anyone touch it until the time was right. 6 weeks before the wedding, Vanessa borrowed it without asking. I found out because my cousin sent me a photo, not to tell me, just a casual picture from a party Vanessa had attended, a themed birthday party, and there was Vanessa in the center of the photo, laughing, wearing my dress, my exact dress, the one from the closet, the one I had altered 3 times. I sat with that photo for an hour, just sat with it, not screaming, not calling anyone, just sitting with the specific sick feeling of seeing something sacred treated like a costume. When I called Vanessa, she laughed at first. She said she thought I would not mind since the wedding was still 6 weeks away. She said it was just one night. She said the dress was fine, she had been careful. She said I was overreacting. And when I did not calm down, when I stayed hurt and said clearly that she should not have done that without asking, she told me I was making a big deal out of nothing and that I always did this. I always made her feel bad for being spontaneous and fun. I apologized before the end of the phone call. I apologized to the woman who took my wedding dress without asking and wore it to a party and called me dramatic for being hurt. That is the kind of person I was then. That is the kind of person the filter makes you. The dress had a small tear along the inner hem that had not been there before. I paid to have it repaired. I told no one except the seamstress, who asked gently if everything was okay. I said yes. I smiled. I went home and kept planning a wedding I was no longer fully sure I wanted. I did not understand yet that the dress was not the real theft. The dress was just Vanessa practicing. 3 weeks before the wedding, Daniel told me he needed to talk. We sat at the kitchen table on a Wednesday night and he looked at me with an expression I had never seen on his face before. It was guilt, not nerves about the wedding, not cold feet. Guilt, the real kind, the kind that cannot hold eye contact. He told me he had feelings for someone else. He told me nothing had physically happened. He told me he was sorry. He told me he thought he should be honest. He told me the person was someone we both knew. He did not say her name. He did not have to. I already knew. I want to tell you what the next few hours felt like, because this is the part that people always ask about. They want to know if I threw things, if I screamed, if I said words that burned the air. I did none of those things. What I did was go completely still. I sat at that table and I felt something inside me go very quiet, like a room where every light has been turned off, not in a broken way, but in a deliberate way. Like someone who finally understands the floor plan. I asked Daniel one question. I asked him how long. He said he did not know exactly. I told him to leave that night. He looked surprised. He had, I think, expected more of a scene. He had expected me to beg or cry or ask questions for hours. Instead, I went to the bedroom and put his things in 2 bags with the calm efficiency of someone who had already emotionally rehearsed this moment without knowing she was rehearsing it. I placed the bags by the front door. He picked them up and said my name once in a soft voice. I did not answer. I closed the door behind him, and then I stood in my own kitchen, and I felt the full weight of everything fall on me at once. I cried alone that night for a very long time. I did not call anyone, not my mother, not my friends, not Vanessa, obviously. I just cried and then I stopped crying and then I made tea and I sat in the quiet and I started to understand things. The wedding was called off 4 days later. I made the calls myself. I cancelled the venue. I contacted the caterer. I returned the gifts that had already arrived. I handled every single piece of it because Daniel was not handling any of it and I was, as always, the dependable one. My mother called me when she heard. She was upset. She was not upset for me. She was upset about the embarrassment. She talked about what people would say. She talked about the deposits that had been lost. She talked about the invitations that had already been sent. When I finally said, Mom, my sister had feelings for my fiancé, there was a pause on the line, and then she said, Sophia, you do not know the full story yet, and you should not blame Vanessa for Daniel's choices. I held the phone and listened to my mother defend my sister in the first conversation after my engagement ended. And that, I want you to understand, told me everything I needed to know about what the next few years were going to look like, if I stayed in that family dynamic the way I had always been in it. I did not cut anyone off that day. I was not yet strong enough and I was not yet sure enough, but something shifted. Something in me started paying very close attention, not in a paranoid way, in a clear-eyed, quiet way. The filter was cracking, and for the first time in my life I was letting it. I moved out of the apartment I had shared with Daniel and found my own place. It took 3 weeks. During those 3 weeks I stayed in a friend's spare room and I worked and I processed and I tried to understand the full shape of what had happened. My friend, whose name was Carla, was one of the few people in my life who had never quite trusted Vanessa. She had never said anything openly, because I would not have heard it, but she had always been a little cooler toward her, a little more watchful. During those 3 weeks, Carla said to me gently that she had seen this coming and she was sorry she had not known how to say it sooner. I asked her what she had seen. She told me. She told me she had watched Vanessa, at multiple social gatherings over the past year, find ways to be near Daniel for extended periods of time. She had watched them share moments that lasted a few seconds too long. She had noticed the specific way Vanessa laughed at things Daniel said, a particular kind of focused laugh that Carla described as performative interest, the kind you do when you want someone to feel seen. Carla had told herself she was wrong. She had told herself she was imagining things. because she knew how much I loved Daniel, and she did not want to be the person who planted doubt without proof. What Carla had also noticed, and this was harder to hear, was that Vanessa had a habit of arriving at things just after I established them. Just after I made a new friend, Vanessa would show up and become closer to that friend. Just after I found a gym I loved, Vanessa joined it. Just after I had a work achievement I talked about at a family dinner, Vanessa would find a way to redirect the conversation toward her own accomplishments, real or invented. Carla said it so carefully. She said, "Sophia, I think your sister has been quietly orbiting your life for years, and taking whatever she could see from the inside." That description sat in me like a stone, quietly orbiting, taking whatever she could see from the inside. I started going back through my memories with different eyes. There was the job recommendation she had used without fully asking. There were the friends of mine who had slowly become more her friends than mine over time, and I had never quite understood why. There was the creative project I had told her about when I was 23, a small side business making custom stationery that I had described in detail over dinner and then quietly abandoned because life got busy, and which Vanessa had launched 8 months later under a different name and done reasonably well with. I had told myself at the time that it was coincidence, that the idea was not that original, that I had not been serious about it anyway, but it was not coincidence, it was a pattern. And the pattern had a name. The pattern was that I was the source and Vanessa was the filter. I built things, I created connections, I established warmth and trust and opportunity, and Vanessa followed the path I laid and picked up what she wanted. The engagement had not been the ultimate theft, not yet. I will tell you about the ultimate theft in a moment, but first I need to tell you about my grandfather. My grandfather on my father's side was a man named Edmund. He was 79 when I was 26. He was retired by then, having spent his career running a small but profitable property rental business. He owned 4 properties, a main house that he lived in, a rental house in the same town, and 2 small commercial units that generated steady income. My grandfather was not flashy, he was deliberate. He believed in writing things down, he believed in being specific. He believed that when you love people, you tell them clearly with paperwork, so they cannot be confused about it later. My grandfather loved me in a specific and consistent way. He called me every Sunday evening. He remembered what I was working on at work and asked about it the following week. When I got my first promotion, he mailed me a card with $20 inside and a handwritten note that said, "I always knew your patience would pay off. I have that card. I will always have that card." When I was 24, before the engagement, my grandfather told me during one of our Sunday calls that he had updated his will. He told me he was leaving me the rental house. Not my father, not my mother, not Vanessa, me. He said he wanted it in my name because he believed I would take care of it. He said he had watched how I handled responsibility my whole life, and he trusted me with something that had taken him 30 years to build. He told me not to make a fuss about it at family dinners. He told me to just know that it was coming and to be ready. I told him I was grateful. I told him I would take care of it. I meant every word. What I did not know then was that Vanessa had been in my grandfather's house the previous weekend for a family gathering. And what I did not know was that she had sat with my grandfather for a long time and talked to him about her future and her goals and her plans. What I found out much later, through a conversation that cracked open a part of the story I had not known exist. Was that Vanessa had cried in front of my grandfather that weekend. She had told him she felt overlooked. She had told him that Sophia always got the attention and she always felt like the forgotten one. She had told him she was trying so hard and nobody saw it. My grandfather, who was kind, who believed the best in people, who would not have imagined his own granddaughter performing grief for strategic purposes, had felt moved. He had put his arm around her. He had told her she was seen. He had told her he would take care of her. And then he had called his lawyer. When my grandfather died the following year quietly in his sleep, which was the way he had always said he hoped to go, we gathered for the reading of the will. My father, my mother, Vanessa, me, my uncle and his family, who received their portion without any drama as expected, and then the part that changed everything. The rental house had been left to Vanessa. I sat in that room and I heard those words, and the floor dropped out from under me in a way that was completely silent and completely invisible to everyone around me. I did not cry. I did not speak. I kept my face completely still because I was 31 years old, and by that point I had become very good at keeping my face still. when something was destroying me on the inside. My father looked at me for a moment. He looked quickly away. Vanessa looked at her hands. My mother reached over and touched my arm and whispered, "He must have changed his mind," which told me she knew. She knew what he had originally intended, and she had said nothing, and she was now whispering an excuse in a room where I was watching everything I had been promised handed to someone else. The house was worth $240,000. I know the exact number because I had looked it up 2 years prior, when my grandfather told me it would be mine, and I had begun, quietly, responsibly, the way I always did everything, to learn about property management. I drove home alone that day. I went inside my apartment. I did not call anyone. I made tea, which I had apparently decided was my response to devastating news, and I sat down and I thought. This time I did not cry. Something was different. Something had passed a threshold inside me. It was not rage exactly. It was more like recognition. A cold, clear, settling recognition. Like a photograph developing in a chemical tray and becoming finally completely sharp. I began to think about everything I knew. I began to lay it out quietly in my mind. The dress, the fiancé, the friends, the state. Every time I established a relationship, she positioned herself inside it. Every time I had something valuable, she found a way to redirect it toward herself. And every time I felt the loss, the family around me told me I was too sensitive, I was making things about me, I was misunderstanding things. The gaslight had been built into the house I grew up in. That night I opened a notebook I had been given as a birthday gift and had never used, and I began to write everything down. Every incident I could remember, every date I could approximate, every name and conversation and document. I wrote for 3 hours. When I stopped, I had 11 pages. I looked at those 11 pages and I understood that I was looking at a case, not a family grievance, a case. The next morning I made an appointment with a lawyer. I want to be clear about what I was looking for. I was not trying to take the house back through legal force. I was not looking for a dramatic courtroom moment. What I wanted was to understand whether anything that had happened was actionable, and more importantly, I wanted to understand my position. I wanted to know what I could protect and how. The lawyer I found came recommended by a colleague at work. Her name was Priya, and she had a specific calm energy that matchedness, because he had not expected to be undermined by a granddaughter he had put his arm around. Priya told me that without documentation, a legal challenge to the will would be extremely difficult and likely not worth pursuing. What she told me next was more useful. She told me to protect everything I currently had. She told me to set up a clear paper trail for my finances, my property, and any shared assets. She told me to document any future incidents. She told me very specifically to trust the pattern I had already identified, because patterns were evidence. I walked out of that meeting with no legal victory, but I walked out with clarity and a plan. That is worth more than most people realize. I want to tell you now about the next 18 months, because this is where the story gets both worse and more powerful at the same time. In the 6 months after my grandfather's will was read, 3 things happened that showed me the scope of what I was dealing with. The first thing was the friendship group. I had a circle of friends I had been part of for about 6 years. 7 people, loosely gathered around a core friendship between me, Carla, a woman named Jody, and a man named Ben who I had met through work. We had a group chat. We met for dinners. We celebrated each other's birthdays. Vanessa had attended a few events with us over the years as my sister, and I had always introduced her warmly, because I was warm, because I was loyal, because I thought that was what family did. By the time I was 31, Vanessa had a private chat with 4 of those 7 people that I was not in. I found out about it completely by accident when Jody responded to a message in the group chat that she clearly meant to send to the private one. The message was a screenshot of something I had said in the main group chat, along with a comment from Vanessa underneath that said, "She always does this, makes everything about her feelings, it's exhausting." Jody sent a quick apology message and said it was nothing, but it was not nothing. I screenshot it, I saved it, I said nothing in the group chat. I went back to my notebook. The second thing was the job interview. I had been building toward a senior position at my firm for 2 years. I had a strong record. I had clear numbers. My manager had told me in a performance review that I was the most organized strategic thinker on the team. When the position opened, I applied internally. The interview process was thorough, 3 rounds, and I felt good about it. I did not get the job. The person who got the job had been referred by an external contact. The contact who made the referral was someone who knew the hiring director personally, which is how these things sometimes go. I accepted the disappointment with grace because that was what professionals did. But a month later, I found out through a mutual connection that Vanessa had attended an industry event with the hiring director's colleague 2 weeks before the final round of interviews. She did not work in my industry. She had no natural reason to be at that event, and she had not mentioned attending it to me. I cannot prove what was said at that event. I do not know for certain that Vanessa said anything that affected the outcome of my interview, but I wrote it in my notebook, because patterns were evidence. The third thing was the apartment. My lease was up for renewal, and my landlord informed me he was selling the building. I needed to find a new place to live within 60 days. I found an apartment I loved, a 2-bedroom on a tree-lined street with original wood floors, and a kitchen I immediately knew I could work in. I told my mother about it over the phone, excited, describing it in detail, saying I was going to put in an application that week. I got outbid on the apartment by $100 over my offer. The person who outbid me was an unknown applicant, and I never learned who it was. I found a different apartment, a smaller one, which is the one I live in now and which I have come to love because I chose it on my own terms, with no emotional residue attached to it. But I wrote the apartment incident in my notebook too. By this point, the notebook had 40 pages. I was not yet ready to act. I was still in the gathering phase, but I was not passive. I was patient. These are very different things. Passive means you are not paying attention. Patient means you are paying attention and you are waiting for the right moment. I had become one of the most patient and attentive people I had ever known in my own life. The version of me who apologized for crying about her own wedding dress was gone. In her place was someone quieter, clearer, and very, very focused. It was Carla who first suggested I reach out to my grandfather's lawyer directly. She made the suggestion casually over coffee, saying she just wondered if there was something in the process of the will change that might be worth understanding. Whether the original version had been recorded in any way, whether the change had been made in the final months or earlier. She said she was probably wrong and it was probably nothing. But she said it, and I heard it, and I tucked it away. 3 weeks later I called my grandfather's lawyer's office. His name was a Mr. Holloway, an older man with a small practice in the town where my grandfather had lived. I introduced myself as Edmund's granddaughter and said I was trying to understand the estate process for personal closure. I said it gently. I said I was not contesting anything. I just had a question about timing. The assistant at the office was a woman who had clearly been there for many years and who had a warm, unhurried voice. She checked the file. She told me the will had been updated 11 months before my grandfather's death. The original version of the will, which she confirmed had named me as the beneficiary of the rental property, had been replaced by the updated one following a meeting my grandfather had attended with Mr. Holloway. The meeting had taken place after a note in the file indicating a family visit. She told me this without fully realizing what she was telling me. She was just answering my question, but what I now knew was this. The original will had named me. There was documentation of what my grandfather had originally intended. The change had happened after a specific family visit, which I could now accurately place, based on timing, as the visit during which Vanessa had cried in front of my grandfather. There was no legal remedy. Priya had already told me that. My grandfather had been of sound mind. He had the right to change his will. What had happened was not illegal. But it was documented. And documentation, I was learning, was its own kind of power, not because of what you could do with it in court, because of what it told you about yourself. It told you that you were right, that you had seen something real, that the thing you had spent years being told was your sensitivity, your drama, your overreaction, was a documented series of actual events that had actual evidence behind them. I was not imagining things. I never had been. And now I could prove it, at least to myself, and that proof was the foundation of every decision I made going forward. It was around this time that I began making changes to my daily life that might have seemed small from the outside, but were enormous to me. I stopped sharing information with my mother about my plans before they were finalized, not because I stopped loving her, but because I recognized that my mother was not, and possibly had never been, a safe place to put unfinished plans. Whether she shared things with Vanessa intentionally or simply without thinking, the result was the same. Information I shared with my mother tended to reach Vanessa, and information that reached Vanessa tended to create problems. I stopped attending every family event I was invited to. Not all of them, not dramatically, I just became selective. I showed up when I genuinely wanted to, I declined when I did not. The first few times I declined, my mother called to ask why. I gave polite and simple answers. I was busy, I was tired, I had other plans. After 4 or 5 times she stopped asking with the same urgency. People adjust to your boundaries once they understand they are not negotiable. I started building a different financial structure for myself. I had always been responsible with money, but in a surface-level way, a savings account, a budget, reasonable spending. Now I became more intentional. I opened accounts that were completely separate and completely private. I started investing in a small way. I took an evening course on property and financial literacy because I wanted to understand the value landscape I was operating in. I was not preparing for war. I was preparing for permanence. I was building something that was mine in a way that could not be walked into and taken. I want to tell you about Daniel now, because he comes back into the story and his re-entry is important. About 14 months after he left, Daniel reached out to me. He sent me an email. The email was long and careful and full of the specific kind of language people use when they know they have done something wrong, and they want to frame the conversation around their own processing rather than the actual damage they caused. He said he had been doing a lot of thinking. He said he was sorry for the way things had ended. He said he hoped I was doing well. He said he had realized in the time since that he had made a significant mistake in the way he had handled things. He did not say anything about Vanessa. I read the email twice and then I closed it and I let 3 days pass before I replied. My reply was 4 sentences. I told him I appreciated him reaching out. I told him I hoped he was doing well too. I told him I had no ill will. I told him I was not interested in reconnecting. I sent it. I felt nothing difficult about sending it. I mention this because 6 months earlier I might have stared at a message like that for days and wondered what it meant and whether I was handling it correctly. By this point, I had become someone who simply made clear decisions and lived inside them. What I found out 2 weeks after I sent that reply, through a mutual professional connection rather than from anyone directly involved, was that Vanessa and Daniel had separated. They had apparently gotten together properly in the months after my engagement ended. They had been together for about a year before things fell apart. The mutual connection mentioned it in passing, not knowing the full weight of what they were saying to me. She said, "Oh, you probably heard, your sister and Daniel broke up. It sounded like it was messy." I had not heard. My mother had not told me. Vanessa had not told me. Nobody in the family had told me. They had just quietly not mentioned it, which told me they had been quietly maintaining the fiction that this was a normal family situation rather than one in which my sister had taken my fiancé, and it had ended badly for her. I wrote the date in my notebook. I was not happy that it had ended badly for them. I want to be clear about that because this is the kind of moment where people expect you to feel satisfaction and call it justice. What I felt was more like the closing of a loop. The understanding that the thing Vanessa had reached into my life and taken had not, in the end, been the valuable thing she thought it was. Not because Daniel was a bad person, but because the things you take without building rarely hold. They do not fit right. They do not stay. They cannot sustain the weight of something borrowed that was never really yours. There is a difference between getting what you want and keeping what you took. Vanessa had never understood that difference. I think she still does not. The next significant event was what I call the group chat incident. I had remained in the friend group quietly observing. Jody had apologized several times for the accidental screenshot message, and I had accepted the apology warmly and genuinely without making it dramatic. But I had adjusted how much of myself I placed inside that particular group. I engaged, I showed up, I laughed, but I no longer treated those people as my inner circle. Carla had fully become that. And I had been quietly building 1 or 2 new connections through my financial literacy course, and through a yoga class I had started attending that had led to a genuine friendship with a woman named Nadia, who was sharp and funny, and had absolutely no connection to my family whatsoever, which at this point in my life felt like a form of luxury. One evening, the main group chat became the location of a conversation that was clearly not meant for me. Vanessa had been added to the group by someone, I do not know who, probably a year or more earlier. I had noticed her presence and said nothing. On this particular evening, there was a conversation in the group about a social gathering being planned, a birthday dinner for Ben. The conversation included details about the venue, the budget, the guest list. And then Vanessa, apparently forgetting which chat she was in, typed a message that read, "Is Sophia definitely coming? I don't know if I can handle another night of her making everything about her hurt feelings over something that happened 2 years ago." There was a pause in the chat, a long one, and then 3 people left the chat, not me, 3 others. Jody was one of them. I left the chat 30 seconds later, not in distress, in clarity. I left the chat the way you leave a room that you have been in for too long, calmly, with your bag and your keys, without slamming the door. I called Carla that evening and told her. She said, "I am not surprised and I love you, and those were not your people. I already know who your people are." I agreed. I also saved a screenshot of the message before I left the group. Into the notebook folder it went. Around this time, something happened with the rental house. Vanessa had inherited the property but had not been managing it effectively. My grandfather's long-term tenants, a couple who had rented the house for 9 years, were moving out. Vanessa did not have experience in property management and had apparently been relying on a loose arrangement with a cousin of hers who had some real estate knowledge. That arrangement had fallen apart. The property sat empty for 4 months. My father called me. He said, without quite making it a request, that Vanessa was struggling with the property, and if I had any thoughts on managing it, given that I had taken the financial literacy course and knew something about property, it might be helpful. I listened to Why father say this? I let him finish, and then I said very gently, "I am not in a position to help with that right now." My father paused. He said he understood. He said it was not a big ask. I said, "I understand that it feels that way, and I am still not in a position to help with that right now." We moved on. He did not ask again. What I recognized in that moment was the specific architecture of my family's dynamic in its most transparent form. The resources and support traveled in one direction. From me, the acknowledgement and gratitude did not travel back, and the expectation was that I would continue being useful because I was dependable and the responsible one, and that was my role. My role, a role I had been cast in before I was old enough to audition for anything else. I had been playing that role for 31 years. I was done. 3 months later, I received a letter. It came in a cream envelope addressed in handwriting I did not immediately recognize. Inside was a document and a short handwritten note. The note was from Mr. Holloway, my grandfather's lawyer. He wrote, been going through archived correspondence recently, preparing for his retirement from practice. He had come across something he believed I should have. He had not been aware of it at the time of the will reading, he said, because it had been filed in the wrong folder during an office reorganization. He apologized for any confusion this might cause. The document was a letter, in my grandfather's handwriting, dated 8 months before his death. It was addressed to Mr. Holloway. In it, my grandfather confirmed that he intended to leave the rental property to Sophia, his granddaughter, whom he described as the most steady and trustworthy person in the family. He wrote that he had spoken with her about it directly. He wrote that he had full confidence in her ability to steward the property. He wrote that he wanted this confirmed in his formal documents. There was a second page. On the second page, in smaller handwriting, as though he had added it later, he had written something else. He had written that he was aware a family visit had raised certain emotional conversations. He had written that he had been moved by what he had heard in that conversation. But he had written, and this is the part I read 4 times, that he had spoken with Sophia the previous Sunday and her steadiness reminded him of why he had made the original decision. He had written that he did not want emotional manipulation, his exact words, to override a considered intention. He had written that he intended to speak with Mr. Holloway the following month to confirm the original bequest. He had died before that meeting could happen. I sat with that letter for a very long time. I want to be honest with you about what I felt. I felt grief, not new grief, old grief finally releasing, the grief of being told you were wrong about something you knew you were right about. The specific sadness of a man who had loved me and intended to protect me, and who had been moved by tears into a moment of doubt, and who had then, in the quiet of his own certainty, found his way back to what he knew was true, and died before he could put that certainty into its final form. He had known, he had come back to knowing, he had just run out of time. I also felt something else. I felt equipped, because this letter, this document written in my grandfather's own hand and filed with his lawyer, was the proof object I had not known existed. I did not know yet exactly what I would do with it, but I knew it was important. I knew it had weight. I knew that the family narrative, which had always been that the inheritance was simply what my grandfather had chosen, was now complicated by something they could not explain away. I made 3 copies of the letter. I placed the original in a fireproof document holder I purchased that same week. I sent 1 copy to Priya, my lawyer. I placed 1 copy in my notebook folder. And I put 1 copy in a separate location I am not going to describe in this story, because some things should stay private until they need to be public. Priya reviewed the letter and told me that while it did not legally override the executed will, it was a significant document. It established intent. It used the phrase emotional manipulation. It was in my grandfather's handwriting on personal stationery, and it was dated. If any future legal matter, any family dispute, any financial challenge arose related to the estate or the property, this letter would be relevant. It was not a sword, but it was a shield, a very solid one. I put the shield away and I waited. About 8 months after the letter arrived, Vanessa lost the rental property. I do not mean she lost control of it in a management sense, though that had been happening for a while. I mean she took out a loan using the property as collateral, apparently to fund a business venture that did not succeed, and when the loan payments became unmanageable, the bank moved toward foreclosure proceedings. My father called me again. This time his voice was different, less casual, more stressed. He told me what was happening. He said the family was trying to figure out what could be done. He said there was a possibility that if someone with financial knowledge and credit stability stepped in, something could be structured. He did not say my name directly for about 2 minutes, and then he said my name. I listened to all of it. And then I asked my father 1 question. I asked him what had changed. He did not understand the question immediately. He asked me what I meant. I said 2 years ago this property was placed in someone else's hands. The documentation and intent behind that placement are something I have thought about a great deal. I said I was glad he was calling me, but I needed him to understand something first. I needed him to understand that I was not going to enter a situation like this as the family resource who fixes things and then steps back to the same position as before. If I was going to be involved, things were going to change. Not in a dramatic way, in a structural way. My father was quiet for a long moment. I told him I would send him something in writing, not a demand, an outline. I told him I wanted him to read it and to show it to my mother and to take their time responding. Then I hung up and I opened my notebook and I started writing. The outline I sent my father was 3 pages. In it I laid out what I had observed over the years with full clarity. I did not use inflammatory language. I did not call anyone a thief. I did not list grievances in a way designed to wound. I simply described a pattern of resources, decisions, and dynamics in our family that had consistently favored Vanessa over me. I named specific events, the job recommendation used without fully asking, the wedding dress, the friend group, the inheritance. I included as a final attachment a copy of my grandfather's letter. I told my father that I was still their daughter. I told him I loved the family, including Vanessa. I told him I was not writing the outline to punish anyone. I was writing it because I could not continue to be a functional part of a family that had never named what was happening. And I told him that if there was going to be any future in which I helped solve a problem connected to the inheritance, there needed to be an honest conversation first. Not about guilt, about reality. My father called me 4 days later. It was one of the most difficult conversations I have ever had with him, not because it was angry but because he cried. My father, who was not a man who expressed emotion easily, cried on the phone. He said he had not realized how much of what I described he had simply not let himself see. He said he thought he had been fair. He said he understood now that he had not been. He said he was sorry. He said it twice. My mother was harder. She took longer. She called 3 days after my father and the conversation circled the truth for a while before landing on it. But it landed. She said, I think I always found it easier with Vanessa because she needed more from me and you never asked for much. She said that like it was a neutral observation. And then she heard herself say it. And she said, oh, I heard the oh, I heard her hear herself. I told her I was not asking her to relitigate 30 years. I told her I just needed her to hear me now. She heard me, imperfectly, with trembling, with self-protection still in the mix, but she heard me. And for a woman like my mother, that was an enormous thing. Vanessa was the last to call. Her call came on a Thursday evening, about 2.5 weeks after I sent the outline to my father. I had been expecting it and also not expecting it. Part of me had thought she would not call at all. that she would have her parents handle it, that she would stay in her pattern of never quite facing the full weight of what she had done. But she called. The call was not what you might expect. She did not come to the call ready to apologize. She came to the call ready to explain. There is a big difference between those two things, and I heard the difference in the first 30 seconds. She said she had read the letter, meaning the outline, and she wanted to explain her side of things. She said she had never intentionally tried to hurt me. She said the inheritance situation had simply unfolded the way it did, and she had not engineered it. She said that she and Daniel had never planned anything, and it had just happened. She said that I had always had things easier than I thought I did, and that I had a way of not seeing my own advantages. I listened to all of it without interrupting. This is something I had practiced, not out of weakness, out of strategy. When someone is explaining rather than apologizing, everything they say is information. When she finished, I said one thing. I said I have. My grandfather's letter, Vanessa. There was a silence. I said in his own words. He described being moved by an emotional conversation during a family visit, and then second-guessed that moment because he recognized what it was. I said that letter is dated. It is in his handwriting, it is with my lawyer, and I want you to know that I am not going to use it to take anything from you legally. I am not going to do that. What I am going to do is make sure it is part of any future family financial conversation, so that there is a full picture available to everyone. Another silence. And then Vanessa said something I did not expect. She said I was so jealous of you. She said it quietly, like a stone dropped from a height. She said you were always so steady and I was always so messy, and I think I wanted everything you had because you made it look like it meant something. I did not know how to build things like you did, so I just took things instead. I know that. I have known it for a while. I did not feel warm toward her in that moment. I want to be honest about that. But I did feel something shift. Not forgiveness, not closeness, just a kind of release. The release that comes from hearing the truth finally spoken out loud by the person who had been refusing to speak it. I told her I appreciated her saying that. I told her I needed time. I told her I was not slamming a door, but I was not opening one either. She said she understood. I believe she meant it. I also believe meaning it and changing are two different things, and I was not ready to test which one she was doing. Now I want to tell you about the property outcome, because it is the cleanest version of quiet justice in this whole story. With the documentation I had, including my grandfather's letter, Priya and I worked through a formal conversation with my father about the estate situation. The conversation was not a legal battle. It was a negotiated family agreement, mediated by Priya, in which my father acknowledged the original intent of my grandfather's will and agreed that the family would work toward a financial remedy. The foreclosure on the property was halted when my father used equity from his own retirement account to cover the outstanding loan arrears, not out of my pocket, not because I demanded it, but because he chose to do it as an act of correcting something he understood he had let go wrong. The property is currently being sold, cleanly, properly, with a real estate agent and a real process. When it sells, the proceeds will be handled in a specific way that reflects the original intent of my grandfather's wishes. Not fully, not perfectly. There are legal limits to retroactive justice, and I have made my peace with those limits, but substantially, meaningfully, enough. My grandfather's letter is what made this possible, not because it gave me legal leverage, because it gave my father something he could not argue away. He could not tell me I was imagining things. He could not tell me I was being sensitive. The letter was in his own father's handwriting, and it said what it said. Some proof objects are not weapons. They are mirrors. They show the people around you what they have been refusing to see. During all of this, I was also building. Quietly, steadily, the way I always had, except now I was building without giving access to the things I was building. I had been promoted twice at work, finally reaching the senior position I had been denied 2 years earlier. I had a small investment portfolio that was doing modestly well. I had real friendships, a small number of them, deeply honest and sustaining. I had my apartment with the good kitchen and the dishes that were entirely mine. I had my life, not a stolen version of it, not a borrowed version, my actual, original, completely unshared life. I want to tell you about the hospital call now, because we have come full circle to where I started. My sister called me from a hospital waiting room 3 months ago. She was having a health scare. I will not give you the details because they are not mine to share, but I will tell you that it was frightening and that she was alone. Daniel was long gone. The business venture had failed. The property was in the process of being sold. The friend group which had orbited her for a while had largely dispersed. She was sitting in a waiting room and she was scared and she called me. I picked up the phone because I always pick up the phone. I listened to her, I let her say what she needed to say. I heard the fear in her voice and I recognized it as real. And then I said what I said, which was that I hoped she would be okay, and I meant it, and I hung up. I did not go. I did not send money. I did not call our parents on her behalf or coordinate the family response or step into the role of the steady one who makes everything workable. I made my tea, I sat in my quiet apartment, I felt peace. I want to be clear about what that peace was made of, because I do know. Want you to mistake it for coldness. It was not cold, it was not revenge, it was not satisfaction at someone else's difficulty. It was the peace of a person who has finally learned the difference between love and self-erasure. The peace of someone who had spent years confusing dependability with love, and years being hurt by people who knew they could count on her dependability without having to offer love in return. It was the peace of someone who had set down a weight she had been carrying since childhood without fully knowing she was carrying it. I still love my sister, I believe that. Love is not the same as access. Love is not the same as a blank check for whatever someone decides they need from you. I love her in the way you love someone whose damage is real and whose choices were wrong and whose future is entirely in her own hands. I sent her a text later that evening. I said I hoped the news was not as frightening as it felt. I said I was thinking of her. She responded with a short thank you. That was all. That was enough. I want to close this story by telling you what I know now that I did not know when I was the girl who apologized for crying about her own wedding dress. I know that the people who love you most are not always the loudest about it. Sometimes they are the ones who call every Sunday and ask about your week and mail you a card when you get promoted. Sometimes they are the ones who sit with you in a spare room for 3 weeks without asking anything of you. Sometimes they are the ones who say, "I know who your people are," in a voice that makes you believe it. I know that a pattern is not paranoia. A pattern is a pattern, and when you have 40 pages of it in your own handwriting, dated and specific, you are not crazy, you never were. I know that quiet is not weak, that patience is not passivity, that the most powerful thing you can do when someone steals from your life is not to scream or chase or beg for acknowledgement. It is to build something so solid, so entirely your own, so carefully constructed, that the next time someone reaches into your life looking for something to take, there is nothing left that was not fully yours. I know that some people come back when things get hard, and they expect to find the same person who always opened the door. Sometimes that door is still there. Sometimes you are standing behind it, but you are no longer opening it out of habit. You are opening it deliberately or you are leaving it closed, and either way the choice is yours. I know that peace is not the absence of pain. It is the presence of clarity. It is waking up in your own apartment, with your own dishes, in the quiet you chose, and understanding that everything here belongs to you and nothing here was taken. My name is Sophia, I am 33 years old. My sister tried to steal my life. She took some of it, but she did not take the most important part. She did not take the part of me that kept building, kept noticing, kept writing it all down, kept making tea and sitting in the quiet and asking the right questions, kept believing that the truth was findable and that finding it was worth the work. That part was always mine. No one was ever getting it. If this story touched something in you, I want to ask you one thing before you go. Think about the person in your life who you have been excusing, explaining away, or shrinking yourself around for the sake of keeping the peace. Think about the thing you told yourself you were overreacting about. Think about the pattern you noticed but convinced yourself was nothing. You were not overreacting, you were not imagining it, and you are not alone. Drop a comment with just the word "heard" if this story felt like something you needed today. And if someone in your life needs to hear this, share it. Sometimes the most important thing we can do is remind someone that they are allowed to stop being the one who always opens the door.